Now, in the US and Europe, governments have warned about a rise in incidents targeting Jews following the attacks on Gaza. In the United States, the Anti-Defamation League reported 193 anti-Jewish hate incidents after the crisis began. And while lawmakers have spoken out against these acts, accusations of anti-Semitism are becoming more widely used to target those who condemn human rights violations by the Israeli government. Here in the US, Democrats have long said their criticisms of the Netanyahu government, which some progressives have described as an apartheid system, should not be labeled as anti-Semitic. This week, 4 American Democratic lawmakers signed a letter to President Biden saying they, quote, reject comments from members of Congress accusing Israel of being an apartheid state and committing acts of terrorism. These statements are anti-Semitic at their core and contribute to a climate that is hostile to many Jews. Now, many Israeli and Jewish scholars are speaking out against attempts to accuse those with legitimate criticisms of the Israeli government as being anti-Semitic. I'm joined by one of those scholars, Avi Shlaim, Professor Emeritus of International Relations at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. He is the author of The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. Professor Shlaim, there has been much discussion lately about what is appropriate language to describe Israel's actions, the actions of the Israeli government and its policies against Palestinians. As a longtime scholar of Israel and Palestine, as someone who's also studied the geopolitics of the region, how would you describe the policies of the Netanyahu government in the occupied territories and the reaction that we see in the UK and elsewhere to it?
I would describe the policies of the Netanyahu government towards the Palestinians as illegal at every level. Everything Israel does in relation to the Palestinians is illegal and in violation of international law, of international humanitarian law, and of UN resolutions. Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem after the Six-Day War is illegal. The settlements on the West Bank are illegal, every one of them. The so-called security wall that Israel is building on the West Bank, which Arabs called the apartheid wall, that is illegal. So Israel is constantly in violation of international law, and all the Palestinians are asking for is the application of international law and the rule of law to Israel-Palestine.
You use all of these terms, and coming from you, an Israeli-British historian, it does carry a lot of weight, but there is this almost knee-jerk reaction to label critics of the discriminatory policies of the Israeli government toward Palestinians and the violations of human rights as anti-Semitic. Just how successful have pro-Israel groups and defenders of the Israeli government been at weaponizing the definition of anti-Semitism and deploying it against critics of the Israeli government to silence them?
Israel's aggressive defenders have deliberately, and I stress deliberately, conflated anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. These are two completely different categories. Israel is a sovereign state, and anti-Zionism is criticism of the state of Israel, and more specifically of its conduct towards the Palestinians. The Jews are not a state. They live everywhere around the world, and anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews because they are Jews. The two are completely separate, but Israel and its friends constantly conflate the two, blur the lines between the two, in order to silence legitimate criticisms of the state of Israel.
But how difficult, though, has it become to redress, to reverse this, as you call it, deliberate conflation that is taking place? Because we saw the vilification of politicians in the UK, where you are, and right here in the United States. Politicians who dared to speak out against the Israeli government's policies. In fact, European governments and parliaments have passed motions and resolutions condemning the BDS movement as well as being anti-Semitic. Are we seeing more governments caving in, or are we seeing the opposite?
We are seeing more and more governments caving in to this pressure to refrain from criticizing Israel. Israel constantly accuses any critic of anti-Semitism. The latest and most striking example is the decision of the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to launch an investigation of war crimes in Israel, Palestine. And Benjamin Netanyahu responded instantly by saying the ICC is anti-Semitic. It's nothing of the sort. It's doing its job to carry out an investigation of war crimes. But the pressure on governments and on universities in Britain to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is huge. The Secretary of State for Education in Britain sent last October a letter to all vice-chancellors of British universities insisting that they adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and threatening to cut off funds to those that did not. So the British government adopted the definition, the Labour Party adopted it, the Conservative Party adopted it, and now there is pressure in universities. And this definition is completely vacuous.
How broad is the definition? Because you are one of many Israeli and Jewish scholars who have objected to it. Just how broad is this definition?
The definition is 2 sentences, and it says that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, but it doesn't say what perception of Jews. Then there is a list of 11 examples that illustrate what anti-Semitism might be. That's not part of the definition. And 7 out of the 11 examples relate to Israel. For example, to call Israel a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic under the definition. And in Israel, a lot of people call Israel a racist endeavor, and there are no consequences. They are free to do so. And another example is to apply double standards to Israel is anti-Semitic, but it doesn't say what is the first standard.
So, and we are seeing, Professor Shlaim, some willingness, though, online by public figures and peace activists to call Israel out, to use terms like genocide, like ethnic cleansing. But that is usually followed by mounting pressure, as you mentioned, and often reversal and apologies. Are universities in the UK, universities across Europe, also likely to give in to this sort of pressure?
Yes, and the universities are giving in to that pressure. In Germany, in particular, where there is legislation passed against support of BDS, because BDS is said to be anti-Semitic. In America, the State Department on its website states boldly that BDS is anti-Semitic. In Britain, 85 universities have caved in to the pressure from the Secretary of State for Education and signed on to this ridiculous definition. And the real purpose of the IHRA definition is not to protect Jews against anti-Semitism, but to protect Israel against legitimate as well as illegitimate criticism.
But yet, though, Professor Shlaim, you do have some members of parliament in Europe, like the Irish parliament recently, just this week, moving to condemn what they call the de facto annexation of Palestinian land. It's very few European parliaments have recognized Palestine. No European governments, I believe, have done so except Sweden. You have called on the British government to right its historic wrongs. What will it take for Britain and others to follow suit? Could you see the day when the United Kingdom would actually recognize Palestine?
it's very difficult to say, because Britain is responsible for the plight of Palestine. Britain betrayed the Palestinians, going back to the Balfour Declaration of 1914. My summary of the history of the British mandate in Palestine is that Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionists. So Britain, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is made in Britain, and Britain has never accepted its share of the responsibility for the plight of the Palestinians. Boris Johnson, when he was foreign minister, stated in the House of Commons that Britain will recognize Palestine when the time is right. But there's been no recognition. And if now isn't the time, when is the time? And the British policy is completely contradictory, because Britain supports a two-state solution. A recognition of Palestine is a step towards a two-state solution, but it would create a more even playing field.
But so how will change happen, though? Because yes, you do say this, and you've written about it. In fact, a year ago, you said the theft of Palestinian land is a legacy of British colonialism. The UK must stand in the way of further Israeli annexation. You've also talked about Israel being the only member of the UN that enshrines its racism into law. But as long as the US and other powerful countries of the UN Security Council continue to shield Israel from any legal consequences, will change have to come from within Israel and the Jewish community around the world? Are you seeing more willingness among Jews to denounce Israel for its actions?
I've long given up hope on Western powers. I think their policy will continue to be pro-Israeli. The most current example is President Joe Biden, who has opposed 3 attempts by the Security Council to call for an immediate ceasefire and to give Israel more time to inflict more damage on Gaza. 12 European parliaments have recognized Palestine, but only one government recognized Palestine, and that's Sweden. I hope that Ireland would be second to recognize Palestine. Ireland is very ahead of the others, and as you pointed out, Ireland, the Irish Parliament and Foreign Minister recently stated that de facto annexation of the West Bank is just as illegal as de jure. So what Israel is doing without formal annexation is illegal. And I did write that Israel is the only member of the United Nations which is officially racist. And the evidence for that is the July 2018 nation-state law, which says that the Jews have a unique, that is to say, an exclusive right to national self-determination in Israel. But the Hebrew text of the law says Jews have a unique right to national self-determination in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, which includes the West Bank. In other words, Israel is officially an apartheid state with 2 categories of citizens, and in other words, Israel is an apartheid state.
Professor Avi Shlaim, thanks so much. Great to have you on the program. Good to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks.